Hi, everyone. My name is Carson Whitenauer, and I serve as the executive director for Uncommon Pursuit. Our vision, our mission is to be transformed for God's mission. And we believe that that's something that God is doing in us and through us and among us and around us. And I would love for you to check us out at uncommonpursuit.net, especially if you get inspired by the conversation you're going to hear today. My guest today is Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, and I love the organization he's put together. He came up with this idea for a website called talkaboutdoubts.com, and I'm very pleased to be available through that website. And if you're watching this and you have doubts and you just want to talk to someone who would very compassionately listen to you and hear about your concern and engage with that area of doubt, there's a huge variety of experts. You can go and request a chat at the talkaboutdoubts.com website. And today we're going to talk about an issue that I've struggled with pretty much as long as I've been a Christian. And that's the question of how to talk about doubts. And I've had to deal with that both in terms of my own doubts and how people have, addressed me with my doubts well or badly sometimes. And also, I've talked to a lot of people with doubts for my whole life. And sometimes I've done it very poorly and wish I could go back and redo those conversations. And sometimes it's been really helpful to my friend or someone I've met. And so this is an area that I think a lot of people, maybe every person, has as part of their life experience. And I think we're going to have an incredibly rich conversation today. This is an area that Jonathan has passionately invested himself in by starting the talkaboutdoubts.com website. So, Jonathan, welcome again to the program. Thank you for giving of your time and your expertise. Please introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself and your own journey with doubt. Like, why spend your afternoon talking about this topic with me?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Jonathan McLatchie, and I work as an assistant professor of biology at a Christian college in Boston, Massachusetts, called Sattler College. And as to my own interest in this subject, I have for many years been fascinated by the reasons people have for deconverting, for leaving the Christian faith. And I have watched literally hundreds of videos on YouTube of people's deconversion testimonies. I've read books by deconverts. I've listened to podcasts by people discussing their so-called deconstructions, the vogue term for it these days. And I have been quite alarmed by just how poorly equipped people apparently were to defend and give an honest defense and articulation of the reasons they have for being a Christian. And so when they encounter objections, even the most elementary and basic objections, people are completely blindsided by them. And that is unfortunate because there's a tremendous wealth of positive evidence for Christianity. And so part of our mission at Talk About Doubts is to give people the opportunity to be adequately informed with the most robust defense of Christianity before they make their decision on whether to reject Christianity. And so I launched Talk About Doubts in December of last year, and we've had well over 300 inquiries now since we began in December. And we now have a vibrant Discord community as well. Over 125 people are signed up on our Discord community, and we run weekly Zoom hangouts with doubters, which alternates between an emotional support group and then every other week we have an online course on the evidences of Christianity, which I teach. We're covering the reliability of the New Testament at the moment with a focus on the Gospels and Acts. And then every month we have online panel Q&As for our Talk About Doubts community as well. And basically the way that Talk About Doubts works is that someone lands on our website, talkaboutdoubts.com, and then they submit a form that advises us of their availability and their particular questions and concerns. And then we distribute that to one of our scholars who has expertise specific to their particular area. And then that scholar will reach out and make contact with them and will schedule a private meeting to talk about their doubts with them in confidence. And so we've had a lot of fruit from that. A lot of people have been stabilized in their faith. And We've even got 4 past inquirers at this point on our team who are helping out with inquiries themselves. So that's encouraging to see people grow and to grow into these roles. Our emotional support group, for example, is run by a former inquirer. And so this is just a long-standing interest of mine, is why people deconvert and helping people to think through doubts in an intellectually responsible and honest way.
And Jonathan, I mean, that is incredible, just that you've given so much of your time and, your finances to this community. I don't see you making a big salary from this initiative.
Oh
What
no, I'm
is it
making hundreds of
that's
thousands from all the
Oh, okay. Well,
from
we
this
need to have a
ministry.
business chat about how that works. Um, but what is it that sparked this for you? Like motivationally, what's going on inside of you? You've talked about the activity, but what motivates this for you? How did it get started? Why? Why do you invest so much in caring for people with doubts?
Yeah. So I really care about seeing people follow the evidence wherever it leads, and to equip. And I'm passionate about equipping people to think carefully and critically through different lines of evidence. How to have a robust epistemology, how to have a robust methodology for acquiring true beliefs and not acquiring false ones. And so I see in the many videos on YouTube and books that I've read by deconverts, I've noticed a number of recurring intellectual pitfalls that people fall into that often results, unfortunately, in loss of faith. And oftentimes also people that deconvert are just not very well informed about the positive case for Christianity. They might think they are informed. Most of them think they're informed, but very few of them actually, when it comes down to it, are informed about the best evidences for Christianity. And people often fall victim to what I call the fallacy of objections, which is a phrase that I borrow from philosopher Richard Whately, who wrote Elements of Logic. And Richard Whately coined this concept of the fallacy of objections, which is where one becomes so fixated on objections and questions that one does not yet have a satisfactory answer to, that one misses the forest for the trees and misses this pillar of positive confirmatory data. And you don't give up a well-supported scientific theory because there's a small amount of anomalous data that doesn't quite make sense in the paradigm. And so likewise with Christianity, there's no shame in having questions that we don't have satisfactory answers to, or even objections that we don't have satisfactory answers to. The question is not, are there objections to Christianity, but rather, are there more numerous and more substantive objections to believing Christianity or to not believing it to be true? And the overwhelming majority of the objections, I think, are against the disbelieving of Christianity rather than the accepting of it. And so that's an important point. I also encourage people to distinguish between questions and objections. Right, not all questions are objections. Questions can, of course, express objections, but for a question to become an objection, you need an additional premise, either that we don't know the answer, and if Christianity were true, we should expect to, or we do know the answer and it tells some sort of internal inconsistency or is at odds with empirical data. Short of that additional premise, it remains only a question. And we all have unanswered questions, but that doesn't necessarily translate into a reason to reject Christianity per se. I also encourage people to distinguish between high stake and low stake objections. So a high stake objection would be an objection to, say, the resurrection of Jesus, or the historicity of Jesus, or the reliability of the Gospels, or whether the Exodus happened, or whether King David existed. These would be high stake objections to Christianity. A low stake objection would be an objection to, say, Calvinism, which is a view about which Christians can legitimately disagree and come to different perspectives. And there's more than one plausible interpretive model for understanding soteriology. And so one is more rational in becoming an Arminian, I would argue. And I say this as a tentative Calvinist myself. One is more rational in becoming an Arminian than rejecting Christianity in toto. Another example would be an objection to young Earth creationism, it's an objection to young Earth creationism. There are other schools of thought within Christianity, and I would argue that it's more rational to reinterpret or adopt an alternative interpretive model for the early chapters of Genesis rather than throughout Christianity in toto, in view of the fact that there is a substantial core of evidence that actually confirms Christianity is true. And so that then the rest becomes working out the details, and we don't necessarily have to have a handle on all of the details in order to have a robust, rational justification for believing Christianity to be true. And so I see many of these pitfalls fallen into often by deconverts, and so I want to educate people about about the evidences for Christianity, and also help them to think in a more rational way through these issues and develop a protocol for systematically addressing their doubts and concerns about Christianity.
I mean, again, I think just the care and the precision with which you approach this and delineate the issues is really helpful. I remember talking to a student, a friend, who was at Boston College Law School, and the church context he'd grown up in, it was either you believe in young Earth Christianity or you are sinning against God, and you are not welcome in our church, and you should not, abuse the name of Christ by calling yourself a Christian if you can't believe what the Bible says about a young Earth. And yet he had come to think that a young Earth interpretation was untenable. And so he was in the grips of a lot of emotional anguish, feeling that it was a very binary choice: either be an atheist and believe in an old Earth, or force himself to believe in a young Earth and remain a Christian. And he didn't see that there were any other options. And it
Right.
was very liberating and freeing for him to realize that there were other choices available to him, and he could think through things in a more generous way, and put the pieces together in a new structure. And I think that was really important for him to realize that he could be a fully faithful Christian and believe in an old Earth and still love God and love the Scriptures. And that was a breakthrough insight for him. But that's not always something that's been taught or been offered as an available option. So I think what you're
Yeah,
saying there.
absolutely. That sort of dichotomous or binary thinking, I think, does a lot of damage to people's Christian faith, because people create these false dichotomies as young Earth creationism or no Christianity at all, and so people go to university and they discover there's actually quite a bit of evidence that disconfirms young Earth creationism, and so rather than just tweaking their interpretation of the early chapters of Genesis, they throw out Christianity in toto, and I think that that's not a reasonable approach, but unfortunately it's fueled by this binary thinking that is promulgated in many churches today.
Yeah, it is common. So, Jonathan, I think one reason people feel that you can't ever be certain about Christianity, or even more modestly, confident that Christianity is true, is there's so much disagreement. Yeah, you've got the Christian version of talkaboutdoubts.com, but we can easily understand there are synagogues and mosques and non-believer forums on Reddit, where if you want to go talk about doubts, you could go and find a community of atheists or agnostics or Muslims or Jews or Buddhists or all kinds of other ways of approaching
Yeah.
reality and truth, and you would find a community that would be happy to carefully rebut every point you've made, and show people that there's a better understanding, and that being a Christian is to buy into a foolish and evil mythology, that this other religion is correct or naturalistic understanding of reality is correct. You could go be part of Bart Ehrman's online community, and he would slowly explain to you why we can't trust that Jesus is God. And so, I mean, given that there are PhDs on all sides of this question, isn't it more reasonable to just say, who knows? I don't know. The experts don't know. Everyone has their own opinion. But it's kind of beyond any of our ability to figure this out.
I don't think that the fact that there are experts who disagree really undermines, in a great way, the fact that these things can be discerned by by a layperson. I think, for example, the existence of God is something which is obvious. I don't think that there's really any doubt about whether a God exists. I think the evidence is just absolutely staggering for that conclusion, both from the physical sciences as well as the life sciences. And I mean, there's a number of really excellent books I would recommend on this subject. I'd recommend, for example, Stephen Meyer's book, Return of the God Hypothesis, or Michael Denton's series. I've recently been enjoying his book, The Miracle of the Cell, which is absolutely phenomenal exposition of the prior fitness of the non-metal atoms, which form the essential building blocks of life for complex life forms such as ourselves. And he also has a book called The Wonder of Water about the designoid features of water and its properties that make life possible. And he has a book called Children of Light, where he talks about the properties of light. For example, he points out that there's a very tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum that is actually conducive to photochemistry and photosynthesis, which is just a form of photochemistry. And that range in the electromagnetic spectrum is so narrow that it's equivalent to perhaps a few playing cards in a stack of cards stretching all the way to the Andromeda Galaxy. It's very, very narrow band. And it just so happens, and then there's also the near infrared as well, which is also a very narrow band that's adjacent to the light light spectrum. And what's interesting is that more than 50% of the radiation emitted by the sun is within that very narrow range. And so you've got the radiation that's conducive to photochemistry, and then it's adjacent near infrared radiation, which is felt as heat. And then it just so happens that that's the radiation that is allowed to penetrate the Earth's atmosphere, whereas the Earth's atmosphere also absorbs the harmful radiation, like the gamma rays, microwaves, and so forth. And so that's a remarkable coincidence. And that's just, the very pinnacle of the iceberg. There's just so much there. I mean, I'm studying the complexity of biological organisms. I'm a biologist myself, and I look at the complexity of something like DNA replication or the bacterial flagellar motor or the eukaryotic cilia or whatever it happens to be. And I study just the ingenuity and the complexity and designoid characteristics of these systems. And it just cumulatively, it just takes the argument for design just completely, in my judgment, beyond question, irrespective of whether someone agrees with that conclusion or not, no matter how qualified they are. And I think that there are some very clear problems with Darwinian evolutionary thinking, and the evolutionary theory just does not explain the data, despite having so many PhD scientists on board with it. As I've often said, if I point out that there's a problem with your argument, and then you tell me that your entire field makes that mistake as well, that doesn't really help in addressing the problem with the argument. I also think that a lot of scientists are committed to methodological naturalism, which basically precludes a design inference from being arrived at. And the same could be said as well of their approach to the biblical text, where there are supernatural elements, particularly miracles, involved there. And so if you start off with the idea that you cannot posit a miracle as being the best explanation of the historiographical data, well, it's no wonder then that you don't come to that conclusion. But that I don't think that really bears particularly much on how strong the evidence in fact is. And in my opinion, the evidence not only for theism but also for Christianity in particular is very, very strong. So does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I've been fascinated by that conversation between Christians and non-Christians who advocate for, the intelligent design hypothesis, and those who advocate for integration of, modern evolutionary theory and the scriptures. And again, I've become uncomfortable with a binary of like, well, if you're a real Christian, you would understand that we can respect science and we would believe in evolution and see how that fits together with the scriptures. Or, well, if you're a real no Christian, you would buy into design and see God's handiwork all over creation and a great design in the scriptures. And, I've come to feel that either way, there are really intelligent people arguing for both sides of that case. I mean, would you say, that design is necessary to finding evidence for God? Or if you don't see the case that way, that there's still a good case for being a Christian?
By the way, your microphone is gone a little bit fuzzy. I can still make out everything you're saying. It's just I'm not sure how that
Oh, no.
turns out on the recording.
Okay. That's not good.
Oh, it's back now to normal, so it should be okay. Cool.
Okay.
You can cut out this section.
Shoot.
Actually, well, you can cut this section out. I just noticed that my computer's a little lower on the battery.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Sorry, remind me what your last point was.
Yeah, I'd asked, do you think the case for God is built upon the design case from the biological sciences, or is it still reasonable to be a Christian even if you believe in evolution?
So I think that I think that the biological evidence, the biological sciences provide very powerful evidence for theism. I think that the case for theism would be conclusive without that, though. I think that the arguments from the prior fitness of nature for complex life is also robust. And for that, I would refer you to Michael Denton's series, which I think is excellent on that subject. If one subscribes to evolution, in particular Darwinian evolution or naturalistic evolution, then I do think that it would lower the plausibility of theism relative to what it would have been otherwise, though, because on atheism, evolution is essentially the only game in town, right? It's Darwinian evolution or something very much like it would have to be true, essentially, if certainly naturalism were true. And naturalism, of course, is the most popular version of atheism. And on the other hand, theism doesn't commit you to that. And so if it turned out to be true, the naturalistic evolution explained the complexity of life, then that would be some evidence favoring atheism. It would raise the probability of atheism relative to what it would have been otherwise, because it's more expected that that's what you would find on atheism than it would be on theism. I also think that it raises important questions about the historicity of Adam and Eve. Because on evolutionary gradualism, there's no first human as such. Everything's on a continuum. There's no. It's not that a chimp-like ancestor one day gave birth to a human being, and we can call that Adam and Eve. But it's a very gradual process, in the same way that it's arbitrary to talk about a particular day in which you become an adult, because it's such a gradual and slow process. So I think that it raises important questions there. So I think that embracing evolution causes problems, but I don't think that it's needed. I don't think one needs to wed Christianity to evolution, because the evidence for evolution is quite weak, and actually there's a lot of evidence against it.
No, that's helpful. And again, I think wherever someone's landing on that issue as they listen to us, that one thing we can all take away is, here are the costs of accepting this hypothesis. Here are the benefits of accepting this hypothesis. But again, instead of giving us a binary either or perspective, you're offering us, let's wait how things shake out as we try and assemble all of this together. I want to keep pressing into that on another kind of line of challenge. And you mentioned earlier the fallacy of objections, or of too many objections, but it does seem like there are a lot of powerful objections to Christianity. I mean, there's a pretty popular understanding that God sets up, so there are billions of human beings. A lot of them have no chance to hear about Christianity. They die and they suffer eternal torment. And that doesn't seem like a very compelling belief system. if you just open up the Bible and you start reading through it, you find out that God sends the Israelites to go into Canaan and kill all of them so that they can have the land. And it looks like, wow, maybe they just made up this idea of Yahweh giving them a divine right to the land that other people occupied. And isn't that convenient?
Mm.
And then, I think a lot of people struggle with the ways in which the gospel accounts don't seem to fit together, and some discrepancies between them, and have trouble finding a way that those could be reconciled. And then if you just move beyond all of that, you look at someone who is supposed to represent Christianity, like a pastor, like Mark Driscoll, and he's a
Mm.
big deal, and everyone's like, Mark Driscoll this and Mark Driscoll that. And it comes out, I mean, the guy is totally not representing Christ in his violence and his anger and the way he just bullied people and was abusive. And despite that, he's still a pastor today, even after all of that's come out. And there's been extensive research and eyewitness testimony that he's a bully and a mean person and a liar. He's still pastoring a church. How can that be compatible with what we hear about, how Christians should live? And of course, I've been very impacted by the story of Ravi Zacharias and all of the
Yeah.
things that were messed up about RZIM as an organization. And, this guy was supposed to be the leading light of commending the faith with truth and reason in a gracious and respectful way. And he was abusing women and assaulting them. And so you look at all the hypocrisy of Christians, and I think a lot of people go, hey, look, a religion that produces people like that, and, there's something messed up with that religion. I don't want to be part of it. And so again, I just want to ask you, like, given the all the different kinds of doubts and objections people have, I mean, don't you think it's reasonable that people have an aversion and a skepticism to Christianity?
Yeah, so there's 3 points there. There's the first of all, what about those that've never heard the gospel? You also so the Amazonian tribesmen, for example, has just never had access to evangelists or the Bible or what have you. And how can they be held to account? Then you also brought up the Canaanite conquest and the ethics there, and then finally brought up Christian hypocrisy. So let's address those in turn. As for the Amazonian tribesman, the person that's just never had access to the message of the gospel, I would argue that this is, remember, I mentioned earlier that there's a difference between questions and objections, and not all questions are objections. And this is one thing I would put in the question category. What happens to people who've just never heard the gospel? And I think that we have good reason to believe in the justice of God, to believe in the goodness of God. The resurrection would be one of those arguments. And so supposing the God of the Bible is true and God is revealed as being good and loving and sent his son into the world to be a ransom for our sins and so forth, that provides us with justification for believing that God is good. And so in view of that, then we can have confidence that whatever God's arrangements are for the Amazonian tribesmen, it will be in alignment with God's justice and goodness. And so I think that we can count on God having some morally sufficient arrangement for such individuals, even if we're not privy to that arrangement. And there might be good reasons why we're not made privy to that arrangement, because who would want to go and preach the gospel to anyone if you're making them accountable, right? And so if I or if the Bible actually explicitly told us what happens to babies, for example, if they die, that would provide an argument for abortion. Some crazy person would go out killing babies because then they get into heaven. So there's plausibly reasons why we're not told what happens to those who've never had the opportunity to receive the gospel. It's possible, and of course we're speculating, but it's possible that for such individuals, God takes into account what they've done with the light they have been given through natural revelation, perhaps, or maybe he reveals himself in dreams and visions or in some other special way. For example, you probably heard in the Muslim world that a lot of people have come to Christ through dreams and visions. That was part of Nabil Qureshi's story, for example. I actually knew someone in my own personal circle of contacts that this happened to, and I know this person on both sides of their conversion, both as a Muslim and as a Christian, and very little interest in Christianity. No exposure to the Bible, and Jesus appeared to her in a dream um, and told her the gospel, and she got saved. And so that can certainly happen. And so that's one avenue that someone who doesn't otherwise have access to the evidence might come to accept the gospel, or perhaps God gives them an opportunity after death, or perhaps the salvific value of Christ's death is imputed to them. It's because they didn't otherwise have opportunity. We just don't know. We're speculating at that point. But as I said, we have reason to think that God is just, and so we can trust that God has some just arrangements for such individuals, even if we don't know what that is. So does that help with that first question?
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that some of those are speculative. It's a speculation I've had that perhaps after death there is an opportunity, but I can't locate a Bible verse that shows that. And it does raise at least the question, why couldn't Jesus tell us, hey, by the way, I do want you to go into all the world because it's better for people to live their lives now with me, and that's good for them, good for their families and society, for people to know the way of Christ. But I want you to know if it doesn't happen, they do get a chance. So again, I'm just saying that it's an appealing thought and one that I long to be true, but I can't tell you here's the chapter and verse in the scriptures that makes me confident that's the case. Um, I think
Sure.
other people would even go so far as to say, look, let's say you had exposure to the message of the gospel your whole life. You were forced to church every week by some force, right? But you never believed in Jesus. Is it still, fair to spend an eternity apart from God in misery because you had a hard heart and made some bad decisions during your life? It seems like the consequences still outweigh the crime, and so I think people have a lot of reservations about this idea of eternal torment. It's just such an unpleasant idea that a lot of people just feel like this is a big problem with Christianity.
Yeah, I totally get that. And just a couple of points there off the back of your remarks. So you pointed out that these are speculative and that the Bible doesn't explicitly tell us one way or the other, and you're completely correct. But are these plausible speculations? Sure. And do we have independent justification for thinking that God is just? Well, yes. And so then it follows that there must be some just arrangement for such individuals, because the judge of all the world will always do what is right. And so we don't necessarily have to have the definitive answer of what the solution is. But it's enough to content ourselves with that there must be some answer in view of God's goodness. And so I don't see that as being a particularly potent objection to believe. It's more an unanswered question. Oh, I wonder what God's arrangements are for such individuals. And we're just not explicitly told in Scripture. Although Scripture does tell us that people are judged in accord with the light that they've been given. So the more light one's been exposed to, the more culpable they are held. So, for example, in Matthew 11, when Jesus denounces the unrepentant cities of Chorazin and Bethsaida, he says, if the miracles had been performed in you had been performed in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes, but it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for them than it will be for you, because you've been exposed to more light. So we just don't know at the end of the day what God's arrangements are. Now, you mentioned people's concern about eternal conscious torment, and I understand those concerns too. And we don't know a lot about what hell is. The images that we're given in Scripture about fire and outer darkness, etc., I think are probably, or almost certainly, metaphorical images. Don't get me wrong; I think hell is a real place, but I don't think that is literally going into a volcano or something like that. And fire and darkness contradict each other in any case. It's an image for some spiritual reality, and there is certainly, I think, conscious torment post death for those who reject Christ and are still in their sins. There is a question of what about the eternality, though, of hell? Is that really just? And from a traditionalist perspective, one could say, well, perhaps people continue to sin in in hell, they continue to reject God and rebel against Him in their hearts, and so therefore that's why the penalty is also ongoing and non-ending, because people continue in their sins. Or you could take another view, which is a view that I'm more tentatively leaning towards, which is the conditionalist perspective, which is to say that hell is not eternal conscious torment. Yes, it's an eternal judgment, but the eternal judgment is not necessarily exclusively conscious torment. Although there is certainly, I think Scripture teaches there's at least a period of conscious ongoing existence. For example, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16 would support that. I don't think that there's any text that unequivocally teaches the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. People like to point, for example, to Revelation 14, which speaks about the smoke of their torment ascending forever and ever in the presence of the Lamb and the holy angels. But if you compare that to Isaiah 34, it speaks about the destruction of Edom and the smoke of its destruction ascending forever and ever as an eternal monument to its total destruction. Or in Matthew 25, where Jesus says, "Depart from me into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels." Well, the book of Jude speaks about the eternal fire that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, totally annihilated Sodom and Gomorrah. And so if it can be interpreted there as being something that completely annihilates, then why not in Matthew 25? Or what about Jesus' statement that where he describes Gehenna as the place where the worm never dies and the fire never goes out? That's an allusion to Isaiah 66, where you have this image of this garbage dump, Gehenna, outside of Jerusalem, where you have this image of God's enemies lying slain there, and it's an image of total annihilation of God's enemies. There's also some text that could be interpreted to support a conditionalist perspective. So, for example, if we look at the let me find it here. If we look at Mark 10, verse 28, it says, Jesus says, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." And so, in the same way that the body gets destroyed, the soul can also get destroyed, according to these words of Jesus. So that you could even argue supports a conditionalist perspective. Does that help to assuage your concerns any?
Well, I'm more raising them just to help people see how it is that you talk about doubts, and I think those are all helpful answers. For me, again, I would rather see someone embrace an annihilationist perspective and still see Christianity as satisfactory, rather than say, unless I believe in eternal conscious torment, I cannot be a Christian. But I'm not yet persuaded of annihilationism
Mm-hmm.
myself, and I think some of the arguments for the traditional viewpoint seem better sustained. But it's not really about my objection. For me, it seems like the methodology you have is, okay, you've got 300 objections to Christianity. That's fine. Which one is most important? Let's talk about that one. Okay, what's number 2? Let's talk about that one. What's
Mm-hmm.
number 3? Let's talk about that one. And you would be happy to go down the list of all 300 and see if there's any of them that actually motivate a real problem with the the reasonableness of Christian core Christian truth. Um, but the number of objections, that since you spent so much time going through so many of them, that hasn't that isn't an issue for you at this point.
Right. You also brought up the issue of the Canaanite conquest, and I think there are some thorny issues relating to that subject. I think that there are a number of points, though, that often get overlooked in this discussion. So, for example, if we go over to Exodus 23, verse 20, I'm sorry, not verse 20, verse 28, God says to the Hebrews, as he's sending them to conquer the promised land, "I will send hornets before you, which will drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and possessed the land. Also, Exodus 33, we read also in verse 2, I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, lest I consume on the way, for you are stiff-necked people. So you can see, again, God has an evacuation operation underway, where he's sending the Hebrews to conquer the promised land. And there's good reasons for that, as I'll mention in a moment. But he, in his mercy, has an evacuation operation. He tries to evacuate the people of Canaan from the land before the Hebrews even arrive there. And so the numbers of people in the lands of Canaan had been significantly reduced, presumably, by the time the Hebrews got there. Now, we also know that the Canaanites were engaged in all kinds of abominable practices, including child sacrifice to their god Molech and so forth. And so the people of the land of Canaan were certainly justly deserving of God's wrath and God's judgment against them as a result of their heinous crimes, child sacrifice and the like. It's also important to note that God in Genesis says that that the sins of the Amalek, the Amorites, which is a Canaanite people group. This is in Genesis 15, verse 16. Had not yet reached its limit. It says, they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And God actually tarries with the Amorites for more than 400 years before he sends the people of Israel against them. And so that also, I think, demonstrates the long suffering of God, which is consistent with his just and good character. So there's a couple of points in relation to the Canaanite conquest. Does that help to assuage your concerns there?
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges that I often experience when people raise this doubt, and a lot of doubts like it, is that we need a really supple imagination. And so I need to imagine, Christianity is false, and these are texts that were used to justify, invading other people's land. Okay, can I read the text that way? Let me try that on. Okay, I'm really going to give that a serious consideration. But then to also ask someone, can you read these texts and imagine what it's like to read these texts on the basis that a good and loving God is behind the authorship of these documents? And if the story about Yahweh is true, and this is reflecting God's goodness, can you read the text that way too, and see how that would shape how the way in which you push the interpretation this way or that way? And I think when people are able to imagine it different ways, they're able to have a more reasonable investigation of this question. And so I think the points you've made have been helpful to me and would be helpful to anyone who's willing to hear them generously. But if it's already like, hey, I already know what happened here, don't try and, fool me, well, then there's no progress to be made, right? But
Right. And
that to me, I think, has been the key in this conversation.
And bear in mind that we're not looking at these objections in a vacuum, but there's also a very compelling positive case for Christianity. And I find that a lot of the people we talk about that they've only really researched the objections, and they're troubled by these things, and they have no idea what the positive case for Christianity is. And so I encourage people, for any complex issue, including Christianity, to research what may be said in favor of this proposition, and then look at what may be said against it, because that helps you to contextualize those objections and see it within its proper context. We want to be taken up to a high mountaintop and shown the lie of the land, and shown the argumentative landscape that what are the arguments for Christianity, what are the arguments against it, and which side has the more numerous, the more substantive objections to believing the proposition, or to rejecting it. And in our judgment, there's far more numerous and far more substantive objections to disbelieving than there are to believing. And I think that the objections to Christianity have very, at least plausible resolutions. Now, you also brought up the issue of Christian hypocrisy, and you mentioned a couple of names, Mark Driscoll and Rabbi Zacharias. And I completely agree with you that this is a problem in the church. But is this an argument against Christianity? I'm not convinced that it is, for a number of reasons. One being that Christianity actually predicts, first of all, that there will be hypocrites and also people who falsely claim the name of Christ and are not Christians. And so the fact that there are, in fact, people who are claiming the name of Christ and yet are not really Christians is not really a severe blow against the hypothesis of Christianity, because Christianity predicts that very thing. So Christians are not perfect. Christ is perfect, and so the sins of Christians, I think, it's certainly sad to see, and we mourn over that when it happens. But I don't think that that's really a rational reason for rejecting the person of Christ, who is perfect and certainly was no hypocrite. He really practiced what he preached. Like he said, love your enemies and do good to those who persecute you. And yet he cries from the cross as he's being nailed to his cross on Golgotha, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. So that's practicing what you preach. Carson, anything to add, or what do you think of that answer?
Yeah, I think logically you're right on the mark, and that empathetic impulse to grieve and mourn this reality is very much necessary for us to do. I think this is something I've seen you do in the Talk About Doubts community, is that there are intellectual doubts, but there are also emotional doubts, and that we have to be discerning about what kind of doubt that I have or that someone else has, so that we can respond to it in the best way. So if someone is observing hypocrisy and that's leading to an intellectual doubt, then we need to respond with, well, logically, this has nothing to do with whether or not Jesus is God. If someone has, just come out of an abusive church culture, that response of grieving with them that you mentioned, I think is really where we need to go, of showing that we care and we are with them, and that rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn, right? And so I think offering care is the best way to engage with that emotional doubt, and over time that shows in real life, in an actual relationship, hey, this Christian is good and trustworthy and is there for me. That says something about the reality of their faith, at least, and the sincerity of their conviction that Jesus is God, and that can open us back up to the reality of Jesus in a way that we might have had a harder time accessing in light of the experiences we've been through.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Jonathan, I think another common objection that I came across a lot in campus ministry is this idea that unless you can get me to 100%, I'm not going to be a Christian. I want it airtight, locked down. I want the evidence to be totally solid. And the reason for this is that it's my life. You're asking for a life commitment from me. I mean, if this was just, hey, I can say a prayer, check a box, and get a ticket to heaven, okay, I'll mouth the words if that's what you need, if that's the requirement. But if you're saying Jesus is going to be the Lord of my life, and this is going to affect my vocation, my money, my relationships, what I do with my time, my ethics, it's going to be a transformative experience for who I am and what my life purpose is. You're asking a lot. So I'd like it to be a high level of confidence. I'd like to be 99.9% sure that this is true. So do you think we can give people that level of confidence in Christian truth? Or do you think we need to settle for 80%? Or how do you deal with that?
I certainly don't think that we can attain certainty, as we cannot for essentially anything in life. I mean, the only things that we can be certain about are the conclusions of deductive syllogisms, and even then, the certainty of the conclusion rests on the probability of the premises being true, so it's not really certainty. And then and also mathematical propositions like 2 plus 2 equals 4 we can be certain of, and we can be certain of analytically true statements like there are no married bachelor. That's true by virtue of what we mean by married and bachelor, right? To be a bachelor, to be a bachelor is not to be married, so there are no married bachelors. And I think that we make decisions, even life or death decisions, every day, in the absence of absolute certainty. So, for example, we board an airplane and we are placing our confidence or trust in the capability of the pilot and the engineering of the airplane, and we don't have certainty of those things. And but we can research, how airplanes work, and we understand that pilots that are flying commercial are very experienced, and so that gives us a rational, high level of confidence in the safety of flying in an airplane. And I think a similar thing is true of Christianity. We can research the evidence and have a high level of confidence, even though we cannot be absolutely certain. And I know a lot of people get very fixated on that one aspect of uncertainty. I mean, I myself struggle with flying anxiety because I find flying in airplanes uncomfortable because my priors get stuck, and that they don't do what they should do, which is increase from experience of flying airplanes that this is a very safe way to travel. So subconsciously, my priors get stuck. That is to say. But rationally, I know that airplane travel is very safe because I've studied a little bit about how airplanes work, and I've seen some of the statistics and just how rare airplane disasters are, and especially commercial airplane disasters. And so I'm a very frequent flyer, nonetheless. And so I think that we need to be content with having less uncertainty in the truth of Christianity. I think that we can be tremendously confident that Christianity is true, and therefore it's a rational thing to affirm and to believe. It's certainly more rational to accept it than to reject it. Far more rational to accept it than to reject it. I hesitate to put a number on my level of certainty because we're not computers and we don't really reason and practically like that. I prefer to compare propositions to one another. Okay, so compare, for example, the resurrection to other things that I affirm with a similar level of confidence. So a similar level of confidence I would assign to the fact that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or that he was assassinated in the Forum, etc. These are historical propositions that are parallel, in my opinion, to the to the resurrection in terms of my level of credence I have for those propositions.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think one of the ways I do that comparison is to say that's I often ask students, well, go ahead and give me 100% confidence that I need to be 100% confident. If that's the standard for accepting a belief, what evidence can you marshal that we ought to always be certain before we believe something like this? And of course, that couldn't be done. There isn't. It was more just like a standard that was asserted, but there was no way of saying, here's why I know I have to be certain in certainty. And the other response
One other point there quickly though is,
yeah.
One point that often gets overlooked is that Christianity is a cumulative case, right? It's not just based on one strand of evidence. So it's not like one piece of evidence turned out not to be as good as we thought it was, and so the whole edifice comes tumbling down. But rather, there's a whole network of mutually converging and supporting, corroborating evidences that all point univocally in one direction, and therefore it's a cumulative case based on a tapestry of evidence, not just one piece of evidence or a few pieces of evidence.
Yeah, one of my good friends, actually, we teach a course together, and for a long time during a series we did, he had a PowerPoint slide, and it had like lots of little circles all interconnected with each other, showing that 30 or 40 different things that were pointing to Christianity being true. And part of his point was, look, even if you don't like these seven, here's 33 that you might find compelling. And the more you look into it, the more your confidence increases that, hey, look at the breadth of evidence. Look at how many facets of reality point in this direction. This is a very reasonable place to be. But the other contrast was to, well, how certain am I that naturalism is true, or that Buddhism is true, or that Islam is true? And comparing that, actually, there's a substantive gap that I'm far more confident that Christ rose from the dead than I am that Muhammad, was receiving visions that originated from Allah. And
Mm.
so I think that's another way of looking at this question of certainty, is to ask that about every belief system and make the doubt more universal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jonathan, what are some mistakes you've made in talking about doubts with people?
That's a good question. I tend to be very intellectual and rational, so I don't relate as well to the emotional aspect. There are people on our team who definitely do relate more in that area. Um, so I've talked to people, for example, that it's just not really an intellectual issue, and so the more you try to address their intellectual issues, it just doesn't work. It doesn't. You can't really make progress by citing, you know, objective evidence. That you have to take a more emotional or pastoral route, and so we have several people on our team that have good pastoral skills for that very purpose. Um, Yeah, I'm trying to think of other examples, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. Not to say that I haven't made mistakes, I'm just not thinking of them off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, I have done that exact same thing you mentioned, of just, uh, I studied philosophy in college. And so when you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so I tried to apply
Mhm.
a philosophical hammer to every problem that came my way. And it took a lot of trial and mainly error to realize that some people just needed to be listened to. um, and there were other ways of approaching the complexity of a human being than my training in philosophy. Um, and Jonathan, as you look, we love our brothers and sisters in Christ, and we're not here to tear down or be critical, but there are some things I think we've both observed about how doubts are handled in some churches or with some Christians. And what are some of the ways in which you see doubts talked about that make you think it's not really the best way to be doing this?
Um, I think that in a lot of churches there's unfortunately a plague of anti-intellectualism and anti-academia that discourages people from asking critical questions, and that's unfortunately very unhelpful. Tim McGrew tells a story of someone that he knows who had doubts about Christianity, had all these questions about the Bible, and was going to a church and made an appointment to see the pastor of the church so he could ask his questions. And so he sat down with the pastor and elaborated on his questions that were causing him so much bother and doubt. And the pastor listened, and then when he'd finished, the pastor took a Bible and slid it across the table and said, "This is the gospel. Do you believe it?" And the guy said no, and he got up and he walked out. And apparently, he told Tim that he knew that that was the last time he would ever set foot in a church again.
Yeah, and we trust the pastor meant well, but that really is an unprepared response to the the conversation.
Mm.
I met a student in Boston, and the pastor had a practice of meeting with all the high school seniors before they went off to college, and he asked her what she planned to study in college. And I know you teach biology as a faculty member, so this will probably aggravate you. But she said she wanted to study science. And he said to her, "Oh, no, 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 no. Do not study science in college. You will lose your faith." And so, the interview finished and she left. And at that point, she said, "I'm not going to be a Christian anymore if my pastor knows that science disproves Christianity and just doesn't want me to find out why, then I know that there's nothing to this religion. And I'm frustrated and upset that he's been, tricking all of us for my entire childhood. And so this pastor, in trying to be helpful, was, the immediate cause of this student losing her faith.
Right, and it's completely the opposite. Faith is completely, I think, confirmed by the natural sciences. I mean, it's overwhelming, the confirmations of the natural sciences for theism, and indeed, I would even go so far as to say anthropocentrism. I think that science is friendly to an anthropocentric view of nature, and that I think is very much consistent with the Abrahamic traditions.
Yeah. So, Jonathan, I think one reason possibly why doubt gets interpreted as sin or as something to be afraid of or something that, here's a Bible and that'll take care of it, is because when we're presented with the doubts, we just don't know what to do. We're not sure how to handle that experience. And when you think about all the doubts we've just touched on in this conversation, and the realization that each of those could have been a full hour talk or a full course of study, and there was another 50 or 100 that we didn't even mention on this one short program. As people they've listened to us, they've been intrigued, they would like to be prepared, but they know they're not. What would you say are some good next steps to become prepared to talk about doubts?
Sure. So there's certain books I would recommend about the evidences for Christianity. So I'd recommend, for example, all of Lydia McGrew's books, Hidden in Plain View, Undesign Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, The Mirror of the Mask, The Eye of the Beholder, her new book, which comes out next year, which I read a pre-publication copy of, which is excellent. It's a popular level book called Testimonies to the Truth. It's a fantastic book on reliability of the Gospels. There's various. I also recommend Peter J. Williams' book on the reliability of the gospel. Is called "Can We Trust the Gospels?" I recommend Colin Hemer's work, the Book of Acts and the Descending of Hellenistic History. I recommend Craig Keener's books on Acts. I recommend William Paley's work, View of the Evidence of Christianity, as well as Hora Paulinae, which is a Latin title. The book's in English. The title means the Times of Paul, on the reliability of Acts and the Pauline authorship of the letters of Paul. In terms of and other resources, I recommend Eric Manning's YouTube channel is an excellent source. It's called Testify. Lydia McGrew's YouTube channel is also great. Wesley Huff has some great content on YouTube as well. He's a PhD student at University of Toronto in New Testament. He's also part of our Talk About Doubts team as well. If you are struggling with doubts about your faith, I recommend talkaboutdoubts.com, giving us submitting a form on our website. One of our team will be in touch to talk with you about your doubts. So these are just some resources I'd recommend. You can also find my own website, jonathanmclatchie.com, where I publish a lot of articles on various aspects of the case for Christianity and tackling objections to it as well.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Actually, I had someone reach out to me just this week with a doubt, and I wasn't equipped to handle it exactly. I got a little lost on how to engage with it. So I reached out to you and asked for some advice. You wrote right back with something very helpful and an article from your website, and that article really helped the person who contacted me. And so I've seen this week a resource from your website help someone with their doubts. So I'm excited to recommend that. And the talkaboutdoubts.com website is a great resource. And then obviously, please come to uncommonpursuit.net. And it's a very friendly and welcoming space. There are brothers and sisters in Christ all around the world. And pop in and say, look, I need to be better prepared to defend the resurrection, or I would like to understand why to believe there's a God rather than no God. And we have a whole category dedicated to conversations like that. And that's a free community to join. I've timed myself, and I know you can create an account in less than 1 minute at uncommonpursuit.net and go ahead and ask your question and start to get prepared for this. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for being with me today and for fielding my questions and being vulnerable with us and giving us some really practical tips for talking about doubts. I want to give you the final word. If you could wave a magic wand and change how every Christian engaged with doubts, what is your vision for what it would look like for Christians as they engage with people's doubts?
I think that doubts are actually healthy and helpful if they're done in a disciplined way rather than an undisciplined way. And so I encourage people to work through doubts in a disciplined manner, not taking a kind of deer in the headlights approach or throwing the plane into a steep nosedive at the first sight of trouble, but actually sitting down and working through systematically your questions, taking them one at a time. I find a lot of people uh, like to work through all of their questions at the same time, and they don't make very much progress on any one thing. So I'd encourage people to be more systematic, work through perhaps the reliability of the Gospels and the resurrection, or humans' objection to miracles, or the problem of divine hiddenness, or the problem of evil, or scientific arguments for God, whatever it happens to be. Just take one topic at a time, one that is most bothersome for you first, perhaps, and then um, satisfy yourself, attain a satisfied mind about that issue, and then move on to the next thing. I think that's a much more healthy approach than just to try and do everything all at the same time.
Mm. That is excellent, excellent advice. And that is something that I saw help many students when I was doing campus ministry. And if I could add two things. One is to pick up on something you've already mentioned a few times, which is don't just look at your doubts, but also look at the evidence for Christianity. That's only fair. If you only look at Christianity through the lens of objections, you aren't seeing it evenly. And a matter of basic responsibility intellectually to look at the case for Christianity while you examine the case against it.
I'll also mention Timothy Larson's book, Crisis of Doubt. Not Crisis of Faith, but Crisis of Doubt. The subtitle is Honest Faith in 19th Century England. And he does, the book's a survey of different people in 19th century England who lost their faith by what they thought were really persuasive arguments against Christianity, only to discover the evidence for Christianity and have their doubts and questions satisfactorily answered, and actually coming back to faith and doing a lot of great things for the kingdom. So it's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. It's called Crisis of Doubt, Honest Faith in 19th Century England by Timothy Larson. You can find it on Amazon.
Excellent. Thank you. I think two other things I would say is that I hope we can all just recognize that doubt can be a painful process and an unwanted experience. And if we can have compassion for each other and be gentle with each other in this area and be patient, instead of wishing we could just lob in the right answer and make it go away, I see someone bringing up doubts as a sign of trust, and I see it as an invitation into conversation and into seeking the truth together and into building a closer friendship with someone. And so I really wish we could see doubt as a bid for friendship and as an opportunity to grow closer together. And then the other thing that I found in my journey with doubt is that doubt has been a way of growing. I had a lot of immature ideas about Christianity when I was 18. And it's a good thing I doubted those ideas, because that's part of how I developed my understanding of who God is and of who the scriptures are. And if we believe that God is beyond our understanding and his greatness and his goodness and his love, and that we are finite and sinful and don't have all the information, then we have to regularly, every morning when I read the scriptures, I need to doubt what I formerly believed as I come to God's word and say, God, what do you need to overturn in my thinking today? And so doubt, I think, is a pathway to growth also. Well, we've just scratched the surface here. Jonathan, thank you for the pleasure of this conversation. I'm going to put links to your personal website and to talkaboutdoubts.com in the description. And if you've enjoyed this in-depth interview with a true expert, I encourage you to watch some of the other interviews I've done on this channel. Hit subscribe for the ones that are to come. And please consider getting involved in the Uncommon Pursuit community at uncommonpursuit.net. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you next time. Bye.